Hello, sorry for the slight delay. A warm welcome to our eminent guest lecturer, Daniel Tammet, and to all of you, whether you're here in person at the Open University or online. According to our sign-up lists, there are at least 700 people signed up to attend online, which is a fantastic number, and there's a good turnout here in the OU Beryl's Lecture Theatre too. I'm going to offer a few words of introduction to Daniel in just a few minutes, but first I need to give those of you who are here in person some fire and safety information. And that would help if that would work. Okay, can you all see that? As those of you who are familiar with the OU campus probably know, the fire alarm is attested on a Thursday. So if it sounds today, please leave the building immediately by the nearest fire exit route and make your way to the fire assembly point and await further instructions. So the nearest fire escapes are through these doors here and down the stairs and out, or through the back there and then down the stairs and out. They are clearly marked and you will be escorted. And the nearest fire assembly point is located by the visitors' car park outside the front of the Beryl. So go to that entrance to the Beryl, and then the assembly point, which is assembly point 11, is at the far end of the car park. If for any reason first aid is needed, the number is 01908 653 666. Smoking area is located on the right of the central walkway towards Robert Hooke building, so please don't smoke in any other part of this building. And please be advised that food and drink are not allowed in this lecture theatre. Now, let's see if I can get this to work this time. No. Right. So the next piece of housekeeping is about asking a question. The question and answer session will commence after Daniel has finished speaking. So if you're watching online, please just put your question into the chat. If you're attending in person here, please put your hand up and wait for the microphone to be brought to you. And just a quick note that, Daniel's lecture will probably evoke lots of different reactions, and there's a widely diverse audience. So there will be some different points of view. So I would just ask that you pose your question in a way that is respectful and considerate of our speaker and also of your fellow audience members. Okay. So to tell you a little bit about Daniel. Daniel started to attract public interest in his early 20s on account of his prodigious skills in memory and mathematical calculation. He was placed highly in the World Memory Championships, and in 2004 set the European record for reciting the decimal places of pi to 22,514 digits in 5 hours and 9 minutes. Daniel's fascination with pi was the inspiration for Kate Bush's song of that name. Scientific studies of Daniel's cognition and brain processes suggested that some of his exceptional memory skills might be due to his having a complex form of synesthesia in which numbers evoke colours, shapes and textures and have different emotional resonances. Alongside his memory and mathematical skills, Daniel not only mastered multiple languages, but also invented his own. And while studying for a humanities degree with the Open University, he was also honing his skills as an author and poet. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in 2004, and his autobiography, appropriately called Born on a Blue Day, because for Daniel, Wednesdays are blue, documents the sense of aloneness and difference that led him as a child to escape to a world in which books and mathematical entities were his companions. It's understandable to be awestruck by the breadth and depth of Daniel's achievements, but of his many gifts, perhaps the most valuable is his capacity to convey the lived experience of autistic neurodivergence with great eloquence through his writings, poetry, and numerous media appearances. It's important to remember that until the mid-1980s, people generally thought that autistic people couldn't speak for themselves. The scientist Temple Grandin was one of the first to challenge this belief with her autobiography, and others followed. And the neurodiversity movement is a testament to just how far things have moved forward. Yet even within this sphere, Daniel's writings stand out both for their clarity in describing the workings of his own mind and for their rich imaginative qualities. Work such as his reflections on the beauty of number effortlessly transcends the traditional divide between the STEM disciplines and the arts. It was in recognition of this breadth of contribution that in 2023 he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Open University, and I had the pleasure to present Daniel for that award. Recently, Daniel has opened the window even more widely into the lived experience of autism through his new book, 9 Minds, Inner Lives on the Spectrum. In this, he writes about, now let me see if I can get it onto your screen. In this, he writes about the lives of 9 other autistic people, as far as possible from the perspectives of their own experience, which he's documented through many extended conversations. It is a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Daniel to the Open University to tell us much more about his life and work. Thank you, Daniel. Let's see if I can get back to, okay. Let's get that back to, okay, it should be in presenter mode now. Sorry about this. Okay, I think we'll leave it like that for now. Okay, over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to Ilona for that wonderful introduction and for making this event possible today. I'm very glad to be here. It's my first time on the campus at the Open University, so it's wonderful to meet you in person, and a warm welcome, of course, to everyone who is watching us online as well. I'm going to be speaking firstly about my own experience on the spectrum, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the scientific studies that I've participated in, and then talk a little bit more in detail about my latest book, 9 Minds, and the importance of bringing neurodivergent stories to readers. I was born and raised in London, East London. My parents were born and raised in England themselves, going back many generations. English was the only language that my family knew and spoke, and yet I remember from as far back as I can remember feeling that English was not in fact my mother tongue, that I had some other language. A feeling of profound foreignness pervaded my early childhood. As Ilona mentioned, autism in the 1980s, I was a child of the 80s, was not well understood at all, both in terms of public understanding, but also in terms of scientific understanding. The word Asperger's was not even used until the 1990s, for example, when the research produced by Hans Asperger 50 years previously was finally translated from German into English. So my parents did not understand why I was so different from my siblings. I'm the oldest of 9 children. So my parents had much experience over time of raising children, and they could see immediately, and then in the context of my brothers and sisters, that my behavior was not typical, what we'd call today now neurotypical, was not neurotypical. And it manifested itself in different ways. I was very sensitive to noise, I was very sensitive to light, I had very repetitive behaviors, and I did not have a delay in speech, I did not have a delay in motor skills. That's often the case for people on what we call the higher functioning end of the spectrum, although some people will say it's better not to use language like low and high functioning, but it's simply a way of trying to distinguish different forms of behavior within the spectrum, which is incredibly diverse, as my writing shows, and manifests itself in many varied ways. So I remember some of my first memories are of going to the library. My parents came from a very working class background, were not highly educated, but had immense amount of love, were very attentive, and entrusted me to their instincts, which were profoundly good. When I began crying, they would put me into a blanket, they would do this automatically, instinctively, and produce a sort of hammock and swing me back and forth until it calmed me. And from an early age, my father realized that I was very interested in words and books. So, although we didn't have many books at home, my parents read, they were both of them readers, but they didn't have money as such to buy books. So they would take me to the local library, and this was my entry point into the wider world, the world of culture, the world of knowledge, the world beyond the confines of a single person's biology or geography or upbringing. And I was very small. I remember being as tall as maybe 2 bookshelves at that first visit. I remember the smell of the dust and the must of the books, the texture of the pages. I remember I guess it would have been a 1960s or 1970s design, which was already dated by the time I went there in the early 80s. I wasn't aware of this at the time, but looking back, see this in hindsight. There were little, I can only describe it as holes. You would take a book and you would climb into a hole and sit in the hole, and this would be where you would sit and read. And I enjoyed this very much because the hole made me feel safe. I was slightly apart from the people who were browsing among the shelves. The first books I looked at would have been picture books with simple language. I looked at the words and the pictures, and they seemed very similar to me. Words have colours for me. So 9 minds, for example, 9 would be a brown word. Minds is purple. And I would see if the colour of the word matched the colour of the picture. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. If it matched, it was particularly attractive to me. And I felt that the writer was particularly gifted. When I looked at the numbers, each page of course had a number. I saw not only colour, but something like shape. I could feel this shape in my mind, so there was texture there as well. Some of the numbers seemed to have personalities. I was very attached to the number 4. I felt very close to the number 4 because the number 4 felt like a shy number, and growing up I felt very shy like the number 4. When I turned the page to 6, the number 6, this was a colder number, dark and like a little pinprick sized black hole. And this felt much sadder than the number 4 or the other numbers. And whenever I tried to imagine the sadness that a parent or a classmate described to me or described within earshot of me, I would picture myself within the darkness and the coldness of the number 6. And this helped me to better understand what sadness felt like to other people. And I remember turning the pages and having all these incredibly passionate, textured experiences. I remember as well that from the earliest age, this is probably the very first visit to the library, I saw how many books there were. I was astonished. And it seemed evident to my, 5 or 6 year old imagination that because every book had a different name on it, on the cover, that if I simply were to have enough time and energy and patience to look at every book, I would eventually find one with my name on it. And that I would be able to take the book, open it at the end, because I was very keen to know how my life story was going to end. Even before I knew how it started, I wanted to know how it was going to end. And then perhaps I felt it would be possible for me to cheat destiny, to actually, knowing in advance, I could in some sense rewrite my personal story, get the better of destiny. And I did spend a lot of time looking through the shelves, trying to find this particular book with my name on it, and I never did find it, of course. And it would only be with time that I would come to understand that in order to find this book, I'd have to write it first, which I've done many times over. And it's wonderful to imagine now in my 40s that my books have been translated into 30 languages. So I can now, as do many readers, find my books in bookshops and libraries literally all around the world. When I started school, around the sort of time that I would have been beginning to go to the town library, the children didn't understand me. And it's very strange to say that. As I mentioned, English was my mother tongue. And I think one of the difficulties was that when I was reflecting in my mind, talking to myself, so to speak, I was not necessarily using English. I was using this language, as I can only best describe it, private language of numbers. Not numbers in the calculating computer sense, but numbers in the sense of the pictures I've described, the colours and the shapes and the textures, which evoke intuitively the relationships between the numbers, which are highly logical. And in this way, I was able to, seeing something that seemed to me particularly beautiful, I would say to my mind self, oh, this is like the number 11, because 11 is a beautiful shape, bright white light, something like lanterns in the night, showing the way. And if I were to eat porridge for breakfast, it would be the number 37, because 37 has a texture very much like porridge. And of course, none of this I could say to the other children. They would not have understood me. They would have taken me for a mad child. And I didn't even know, even more importantly, that I should find the word, or try to find the words, in order to describe and translate what I was experiencing into English. This did not occur to me. My memories of school, my early memories of school, are of complete and utter bewilderment. I've always had a very poor sense of direction, and going into the school buildings and trying to navigate the different corridors and find my way around the rooms was incredibly complicated for me. And I would always remember the tiny details, the way that light plays on the one of the brick walls, for example, or the way that the leaves would make a particular sound in the playground. The children talked among themselves. They played in ways that were instinctive, intuitive to them. I did not get this at all. I would spend a lot of time apart from them, looking at the trees. As I mentioned, there are trees around the beaches, I believe, around the circumference of the playground, around the perimeter. And I would go to the trees, and I would not, children would say to themselves, Daniel is talking to the trees. I never talked to the trees. I knew that trees do not talk to human beings. Perhaps they talk between themselves, and it would be interesting to imagine what beeches and elms and oaks would say to one another. But I didn't have this particular language. I simply was exploring the texture of the bark, for example, on the surface of the tree. I would see the way that the light played in the leaves, and I would say to myself, well, this is like such and such number. Or the texture of the bark is like the word cufflinks, for example, and even though I didn't know what the word cufflinks meant, I had heard it somewhere or read it somewhere, and the word felt to my mind's fingers rather like the texture of the bark, the peeling bark on the tree. And I would be speaking aloud without realizing it, and the children would be hearing this and watching this, and so they would say to themselves, Daniel talks to the trees. Of course, I was bullied. Children can be incredibly cruel to those that do not fit social codes and do not understand why the person is different to them. My difference was in many ways invisible. And so they tease me, they would bully me, they would imitate my gestures. I would, for example, as many autistic people, I would, in periods of stress or high emotion, clap to myself, take my hands together beneath the chin and make a clapping movement. And they would imitate this to me. And even so, I didn't stop doing it. It was so instinctive until one day my mum caught me doing this and said to me very firmly to stop, because otherwise the children would forever tease me doing so. And from that day on, I realized I was able consciously to make the adjustment in my behavior and find perhaps other ways of managing those emotions. One of which, for example, was to collect conkers. For those of you who've read Born on a Blue Day, you probably remember this. I would go into an avenue that were lined with chestnut trees, horse chestnut trees, and I would, in the autumn, I would collect the conkers as they fell and the shells broke open, and the conkers were smooth and they fit the palm beautifully. I would take them and hold them in my palm, and it would be a very soothing texture to simply hold and grasp a conker. And the shapes and the textures of each conker being so different, I could associate them with words and say that this conker feels like the word weekend, or this conker feels like the word ballet, because of the way that I experience each word as a particular texture or a particular shape, rather like a number. And one particular game I would play, collecting these conkers, bringing them home with me, was to realign the conkers into a sentence and make up sentences in this way. My parents didn't necessarily understand what I was doing. All they could see was me collecting all of these conkers, bringing them into the house. It got to one point where there were so many conkers in my bedroom that my parents were worried that the floorboards would give way. And so one day my father took a huge bin bag, he collected all of the conkers and threw them out. But I understood. I was able to shed that particular habit as I'd shed other habits and find new ways of doing this, of manipulating words in my mind. More and more I was able to do this entirely in my mind. I would go back to the library and read books, and the books were increasingly thick and increasingly complicated. I remember going to dictionaries and reading dictionaries because of the words and all the different colours and textures. It was incredibly enthusing for me and creative to play with words in this way. And then I progressed to children's stories and biographies. I was very interested in learning about other lives, other minds, and then eventually to novels. And the library was old, as I've mentioned, even for the period, and the novels tended to be books from the 1950s, this sort of period. I didn't, again, understand this so well at the time. I read the novels in the hope of learning how to acquire a language in English that the children in the playground would understand, not understanding that children do not speak like the novels of the 1950s. So I would go into the playground the next day confident of my ability at last to fit in and begin speaking like a walking novel of the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And the children, of course, renewed their sense of bemusement and their teasing until my mum, as you can probably guess, quite a strong-willed woman, decided that enough was enough and went into the playground like a cat among the pigeons and said, if any of you approach my son again and tease him and bully him and physically menace him, then you'll have me to answer to. And from that moment on, fortunately, the children thought it best to leave me more or less alone. But I was still trying to understand how they spoke to each other, how a language worked, and it was very confusing. So I continued to read and believing that it wasn't my fault or the children's fault, it was the novel's fault, believing that novels were simply badly written, novels with unrealistic dialogue. I tried to find other novels with better written, more realistic dialogue in order to import these sentences into the playground and try to pass off as what we'd call today a neurotypical child like the others. And of course it didn't ever quite work, but the whole process of going back and forth and reading a wide range of stories and dialogue in this way at least allowed me to get better and better. And of course I had a second school, I should mention, a school at home, because having also many brothers and sisters meant that I was constantly stimulated. We know now, have known for a long time, how important early life stimulation is to children on the spectrum. And my brothers and sisters did not consider me different, did not consider me neurodivergent or whatever the word would have been, even if it had existed at the time, which it didn't. They simply saw me as their big brother. And I read them bedtime stories, for example, and I invented rather sophisticated games that they happily submitted to. And one of those games was, for example, what we simply called libraries. And I would take all of the books that we had in the house, a relatively modest number of books, and invent this very sophisticated system of alphabetization and listing all the different titles and authors and so on. And the children would gamely come in one by one into the bedroom and take a book, and I would give them a ticket, and I would pretend to stamp the book and say to them, you have such and such a length of time to read a book, and then bring it back to me. And so they happily played along, and similarly I tried to play with them as well and to learn from them by observation first and foremost how they made friends. I was incredibly envious of one of my brothers who was very socially gifted, it seemed to me, and very at ease with other children, able to make friends very easily. One day, this particular brother was invited on a holiday with his friend and his friend's mother and grandmother. And for some reason, the family had the kind attention and to ask me along as well. And so I came, and I felt incredibly confused again, because I didn't know what to do, what to say. I was very shy, the complete opposite of my brother. So I leaned on him quite a lot for support and encouragement. The one good thing about this holiday, though, was that it helped me to learn motor skills, other motor skills. So walking and so on had come easily enough to me that I know of. But, for example, learning to swim was something that was incredibly hard for me. I had very little coordination in the pool, and you would put me in the pool and I would just sink. And so the children that were much younger than me, several of my siblings, could learn to swim long before I could. And as it happened, I was on this particular holiday, I would have been maybe 10, at least 10 by then, and I found myself in a pool with the grandmother of this particular child, a neighbour, a friend of my brother. And the grandmother said to me, "Oh, you can't swim. You should do this." And she showed me the breaststroke. For some reason, no one had ever thought to show me the breaststroke before. We were always taught to do the doggy paddle, which didn't work for me at all. And simply her showing me how to do this, and the confidence and the simplicity and the grandmotherly affection with which she said all of this combined meant that I imitated her in such a way that it just worked instantly, and I could swim. And so I was forever grateful to her, for this lady, for this. I started learning languages in early to mid-childhood. As I mentioned, English was like a foreign language to me. The first foreign language I heard was quite an unusual language. It was Finnish, because there was another neighbour moved in a few doors down from my family. She was from Finland. The father was Scottish. The family's name was McEwen. And I had a daughter who was younger than me, similar age to my sister. And the girls played together. Sometimes they would come to the house. The daughter didn't speak Finnish, but the mum was keen for her to learn at least some. At that time, it wasn't necessarily understood that raising a child in two languages was a good thing. Good cognitively, good socially, good culturally. There was a kind of misunderstanding which persists in some areas today, that says that if you raise a child in two languages, the child will be confused, will have a significant delay in both languages. And this isn't supported by research at all. So for some sort of reason like this, the parents had not raised the child bilingually. And the daughter, in fact, had got to an age where she didn't want to learn Finnish, unfortunately. She wanted to be like the other children and not have to speak some strange language at home. So she had been given this particular girl, local neighbour, had been given a picture book by her mum, and a Finnish picture book, and she didn't want it. She gave it to my sister, and my sister in turn knew who to give it to. She gave it to me. And so I opened this picture book one day. I would have been maybe 8. This was before I learned to swim, therefore. I opened the book, and this was the first experience of foreign languages that I remember. Seeing the pictures for apples and shoes and dogs and cats, and seeing the word underneath the picture for each object. And the picture and the word seemed to fit in a new kind of way, and it was incredibly beautiful to my mind, and I felt that maybe I was Finnish, and this explained everything, including my blue eyes and blonde hair. And I turned another page, and there was I remember very, very well, a picture of a house with the word in Finnish underneath talo, and I said to myself, I would love to live in the house of the Finnish language. I would feel perhaps like I finally belonged. I never did acquire a good level of Finnish, unfortunately, because it was impossible to spend enough time with the neighbour's mother for her to teach me. I had some vocabulary and later learned some of the grammar, which is very different to the grammar of many Western languages. For one thing, they use postpositions rather than what we use, prepositions. So instead of saying in the house, they will say house in. Without the article, without the or a, and they don't use articles in Finnish. So it was a very interesting, very novel way of communicating that I found absolutely fascinating. And learning even this little amount of Finnish made me feel confident that if I continued to acquire different languages, perhaps I would one day find my mother tongue, my true mother tongue. So when I began secondary school, I started to learn French. I was taught French. I was good enough at French, so I was given a second foreign language at school. At secondary school, I learned German. And again, some of the children teased me and said, well, maybe you're German. Because again, of your blonde hair and blue eyes. So I said to myself, well, maybe I'm German. But I felt more Finnish than German. But anyway, I truly didn't know what I was. And every time I learned another language, it was not in the perspective of acquiring languages like a butterfly collector will collect butterflies and pin the wings and say I have such and such number of butterflies in my collection. That wasn't at all my idea. My idea was simply to spontaneously, intuitively reach out for these languages in the hope of eventually touching upon the language that was truly my own. Of course, rather like looking for the book with my name on it in the childhood library, I never did find this language, but in the process I did acquire a certain degree of proficiency in a number of languages, going so far as Esperanto, which I started to read about one day in a library as a teenager and found the whole idea both incredibly poetic and of course doomed to certain failure, but at least it was a poetry that I could subscribe to and enjoy learning for its own sake. As I came through school, secondary school, like primary school, I performed well academically. I had very good grades, and my parents were very proud and expected me to go on to university. I struggled still with social skills. I struggled learning how to read body language, for example, and to decipher jokes and to know how long or not to look someone in the eye, which are skills that come very easily to most neurotypicals, but for people on the spectrum they can be rather more baffling. Not impossible, of course, to acquire by any means, but in the same way that I had to make a conscious effort to acquire a number of foreign languages, body language, social skills. These were like other languages, foreign languages to me that I had to acquire over time, with paying special attention along the way. And I remember one teacher helping me a great deal, a German teacher, who in secondary school, who invited me to her home after class some evenings. And she was quite an eccentric lady. I don't know if she was neurodivergent herself. She quite possibly was. The children often would tease her behind her back because she was quite eccentric in her dress and her way of behaving and speaking. But I was very fond of her, and the fondness was mutual. So she invited me home, and I was expecting to pick up some more German. She was paid, after all, by the school to teach me and the other children German. But as it happened, very quickly, we were speaking entirely in English. And again, with hindsight, looking back, I realized now that what she was actually doing was helping me to learn English itself as a conversational language. She understood that I wasn't yet able to speak fluently enough in what was meant to be officially my mother tongue, after all. So she would be like a mother or grandmother rather to me and help me to acquire conversational English to a high degree. Even so, I didn't go to university. I would go to university many years later, thanks to the Open University, and acquire a first-class degree in the humanities online from my home in Paris. I instead went to Lithuania. I felt that, having always grown up feeling foreign, I would certainly live overseas, and so Lithuania was one attempt to do so. I spent almost a year over there. It was not very long after the Soviet Union fell. You can imagine my parents' concern at the idea of me flying all the way over to the Baltics, behind what had long been the Iron Curtain by myself, but it was a government scheme, so there was a lot of support, and I was adopted, I should say, almost by the women. I taught at a women's centre. I taught English, rather ironically, and I had so many substitute mums and grandmothers looking after me, teaching me Lithuanian, and I was in exchange teaching them English as best I could. And the fact that I had struggled so long to acquire this language meant that I could understand their perspective perhaps better than many native speakers would, and come up with innovative ways of teaching the language. So instead of using textbooks, which seemed rather dry and dusty, I would use songs and poetry and teach language in a much more intuitive way that seemed to be much more to their liking. And I also remember from that time in Lithuania learning the importance of books and literature, because they had come through 50 years of Russification. They were not meant to use Lithuanian and to write in Lithuanian, even sometimes to converse in Lithuanian. They were meant to stick to Russian. So when the Soviet Union fell, they made a point of using no Russian at all. If you asked for directions in the street in Russian, they would respond politely but give you the wrong directions in Russian. So they were very proud of their language, a very poetic, literary language in its own right, and they gave me stories of the courage that they had needed to hide books under floorboards for all these years, and the importance, the power that the written word could have to the extent of unnerving these incredibly despotic regimes. And so I came away from this understanding something of the great power of the written word. I wouldn't go quite so far as to say the pen is always mightier than the sword, unfortunately, but it is something very powerful in its own right, so to speak. And so this is something that stayed with me. Coming back from Lithuania to the UK, I felt I was coming into my 20s. I was incredibly confused again. I didn't want to, with all due respect to England, I felt my home should be elsewhere. I had no clear notion of what I was going to do with my life, and no role models of any kind to follow. My parents had been full-time parents. There was no sense of what my mind, capable as it was, could actually have me do later on. So I latched on to whatever I could. There was a volunteer grant, a small amount of money from my time in Lithuania, and with that money I was nonetheless able to purchase what was my family's first computer. And one day, looking online and coming across a website that was dedicated to the number pi, that's a website that was based in Tokyo, a supercomputer apparently that his whole existence was dedicated to the calculation of pi. I remember learning about this number as you would have done in secondary school, and I remember feeling very frustrated that I'd only been taught the first 2 or 3 digits of pi, 3.14, possibly 3.141, and feeling that this was like teaching Shakespeare and only giving children the first 3 words of Macbeth or Hamlet, and feeling that there's a whole story here that's not being told. And so with the computer's help, I was able to print off many sheets of A4 sheets of paper, and so many that I could have wallpapered my room with them. And on each sheet was hundreds and hundreds of digits of pi. And this particular winter was the winter of 2003. It was a particularly cold winter. I was at home and I spent all this time reading the numbers of pi, and because I could experience them synesthetically with colours, textures and so on as I've described, it was like going into another land, a land of numbers, a land perhaps that was my own, my home country. And feeling my way through these landscapes, I felt incredibly calm. And it was like learning something by heart, as we say in English, and I really like this expression, learning something by heart. It was not just with the brain, but with the heart, with the whole of my person. And I felt like reciting, as I recited to myself some of these digits, it was like poetry. And when I recited pi, I realized for the first time in my life I didn't have an accent. I was accentless. It was almost like pi was my first language, after all. And so I contacted a charity. I had epileptic seizures, unfortunately, as a small child, very common for people on the spectrum, unfortunately, and luckily grown out of them with time. But I'd always remembered how disabling or frightening that experience was. And the epilepsy charity was very enthusiastic at the idea of organising an event, a public event, around what would be a recitation of the number pi. So in 2004 I went up to Oxford on March 14th, which Americans consider Pi Day, 314, and for 5 hours and 9 minutes I recited from memory the first 22,514 decimals without a mistake. The mathematicians in the room had the arduous task with their very sharp pencils of verifying every digit along the way. And what was wonderful about the event was not only that there were mathematicians, but there had been an article in the Times the morning of the recitation, so it was national news, and people were very curious to come and listen to the man who speaks Pi, as people said, speaks the language of Pi, and so they came and they listened. They came from all walks of life. Some of them had travelled quite far to be there, or had happened to come into Oxford on that day. One lady was from America, for example. And they listened and they related to this story of Pi in a way that they hadn't necessarily expected, in a way that was not only intellectual, recognising their birth dates, for example, in the sequence of digits, or their passcodes, and hoping no one else noticed and would know to pick it up, or without knowing it, the date of their future deaths. They realised that Pi in Pi was everything, including the story of my life. And they listened to this, and this number embodied by this young man, spoken with such fluency, and they were completely moved, some of them literally to tears. And I realised then that as I've said before, if I had a gift, it was not simply to count, but to recount. And it was the beginning of my vocation as a writer. I realised that this was what I was meant to do. Before I talk very briefly, before I finish, about this latest book, Nine Minds, I should mention briefly some of the studies that I've participated in, scientific studies. I understand that the British Neuroscience Association has kindly helped to sponsor this event. There are two ways, to my mind, complementary of understanding conditions like autism. One is looking from the outside in, and I'll come to the other in a moment, of course. Scientists, neuroscientists, in order to understand how minds work, including atypical neurodivergent minds, are looking from the outside in. They're having to come up with theories and hypotheses based on observation and data. I was asked to perform as a subject in a number of studies in California at one point, and more so in Cambridge at the Cambridge University's Autism Research Centre. I was put into a scanner, which is quite, for some people I imagine, quite an intimidating experience. But because of my early experience of epilepsy and the fact that I'd gone through many scanners as a consequence, I was very familiar with the experience and didn't have any qualms about it at all. Nor did I consider myself a guinea pig, as some people might have feared. I felt I was an actor in the studies. My role was clear-cut, it was clearly communicated. The researchers were incredibly patient and explicit with me. So some of the results were surprising to me. I remember, for example, being shown photos, pictures of faces with different emotions, and being asked to tell the researcher what the emotion was. And I did. This person is happy, this person is angry, this person is like the number 6, sad. And I apparently scored rather well, or at least I believed I did. In fact, the researchers were not looking to ask me to remember emotions at all, but were trying to see how well I could remember facial expressions, faces themselves. And they subsequently retested me a short time later and asked me to look again at different pictures, some of which I'd seen and others I hadn't, and to identify those that I had seen and those I hadn't. Subjectively, I felt I'd scored well. I had recognised and distinguished faces I'd previously seen only 30 minutes before, and others. And in fact, it was discovered that I had, at that time in my life anyway, my 20s, a memory of faces typical of an 8 or 9-year-old. And this was very surprising because, as Ilona mentioned, I'd previously participated in what some people call the World Memory Championship, and in this particular championship there was a game that they give you where you have to remember faces with names and link the faces to the names, and I'd scored incredibly well, so well in fact that I'd scored 30% above any of the so-called world memory champions. And this was incredibly bewildering to me and would become a source of commentary online for some people afterwards, how to reconcile these completely different results. And of course, one very simple explanation is that the first game was based on linking names to faces, and it only required me to link the colour or the shape of a particular word, the name, with a nose or an ear or the wallpaper in the background of the photo, detail and detail. Whereas the faces I was given in the subsequent experiment several years later were faces, simply faces, expressions. I had no way of linking my synesthetic words or colours or so on to the faces themselves. And in fact, the way that the researchers had produced the experiment so that I didn't know to prime myself consciously to perform well, which was very clever of them and shows just how ingenious, unnecessarily ingenious scientific experimentation is, meant that I wasn't able to prime myself, and the result was therefore very interesting both for them and for myself. It gave me new information about myself. So these experiments were very important to me personally. They gave me new information, new understanding of myself. They were very important for the scientists as well, who have gone on to produce new protocols, new ways of working with subjects, both on and off the spectrum as a consequence of these experiments. The other way, and I'll finish on this, the other way of looking at the neurodivergent experience, of course, is from the inside out. And this is something that I've made the focus of my career for many years. I've been writing for 20 years now. I've produced a body of work that spans poetry, fiction, essays, memoir, and translation. And to my knowledge, it's a unique body of work. There are very few neurodivergent writers in the field for all kinds of reasons, partly because of the way the publishing works, partly because for many years it was believed that neurodivergent people could not write well and creatively, imaginatively, because they did not have the cognitive skill, they did not have the empathy, for example, to do so. This was the contention of a number of people. And for example, when I wrote my first book, Born on a Blue Day, I remember certain critics wondering whether the book had been ghostwritten, because they found it almost impossible to imagine that a young autistic man could produce a book at all. And this book was rather simple. It was essential for me to tell. It wasn't a writer's book, as I say now. It was a book that I had to write in order to become a writer, in order to learn how to write. But it's an essential book in my body of work in order to understand where I come from, the story of my life, how I came to become the writer I've become today, speaking to you now. And so in 9 Minds, which is my latest book, it's what we call narrative, creative non-fiction. I've spent a number of years interviewing and researching the lives of 9 men and women from around the world, all of whom are on the autistic spectrum and identify as such, have spoken publicly about their autism. In many cases I was able to speak with them directly or with their family members. Their lives and careers are incredibly diverse. I don't have the time to go into them in any detail, unfortunately, but I really do invite you, if you are interested in neurodiversity and in neurodivergent literature, which is very new, but very important, I feel, in the same way that for many years women's stories or LGBT stories or black and Asian stories were neglected by publishing and the wider world, and now that they exist and readers are incredibly happy to see the world in a completely new way, and neurodivergent lives are just as compelling. Their inner lives, which is a big focus of the book in particular. Autistic men and women do have, of course, fears, joys, hopes, ambitions. Their inner lives are just as rich and emotional as mine, as I explained to you. And so just to give you a very, very quick idea, I can't summarize all 9 of the individuals, but for example, there is it goes from a non-verbal autistic man in America who has learned to communicate with music and yoga and painting and also a computer device. It's a way of communicating that gives him a voice. It was a rather rudimentary way of communicating for a long time, and as technology has improved, it allows him to communicate independently. His mother, Eve, has been like a lioness for her son, advocating on his behalf, helping him, and ensuring that he had the best opportunities in life. When he was first diagnosed as non-verbal, the doctors in the early 1990s told his parents to put him in an institution. They refused. When she asked them how she could help him to acquire skills, for example, learning how to tie his shoelaces, the doctor said, but why bother even trying? Velcro will do the job just fine. And in spite of these attitudes, which are fortunately those of another time, she was able to find schools that were able to adapt to his very specific needs, allow him to learn to communicate with picture cards and later with his computer device. There's also the story of Amanda in Australia. Amanda is autistic and she was also born blind. Amanda has recently graduated from a university in Sydney in Australia. She has a doctorate. I believe it may be the first such doctorate in the world. And her study is on the impact of different forms of impairment or disability on literary creation. Her work has focused on the poet Les Murray, who was considered a Nobel Prize contender for many years and was autistic. But because he was a Nobel Prize contender, critics refused to consider him as autistic because it just did not fit into their way of understanding autism or literature. And she actually approached me because of her doctorate, in which she wrote about my own work and my translation of Murray's poetry into French. And as a result of this correspondence, I was able to invite her to participate in the book, which she kindly agreed to do. I was fascinated by how she learned to acquire language through Braille, and how she was able to navigate the world using sound, what we call echolocation, similar to what bats and whales do. If she were to come into this room today, for example, Amanda would be able to use sound, the sound waves that we can't ourselves, as sighted people, distinguish very easily. She would be able to understand how big the room is, the dimensions. She would know where I was standing, the dimensions of the furniture. She would know there's a bottle of water beside me. She would know how full the bottle of water is, because the sound would be different depending on how full or not the bottle is. So, incredibly rich sensory experience that she's also able to bring into her study of literature. So she has an entirely new approach to literature, tactile and sensory, and gives her insights into, for example, the poetry of this incredibly important poet that have not been written before, and shows the contributions, academic as well as all other kinds, of people on the spectrum. And just to finish on one other example of a very different, just to give a very different experience of autism, Warren, who is one of the British people in the book, is based in Birmingham, West Midlands, and for many years he was a murder detective and was able to use his autism to solve, I think it was 92 murders during his career. And he was able to find clues to incredibly complex cases in some instances that were obviously there for the taking, but which his colleagues, his neurotypical colleagues, for all of their important skills and experience, were not able to spot. And he did. He had that incredibly fine attention to detail, and a resistance, perhaps as well, to conventional thinking that often would hoodwink his colleagues. His colleagues were sometimes so convinced of the culpability of such and such a person that they were not able to see that it was an entirely different solution. And because his way of thinking is different in many interesting ways, he was able to avoid these traps and find his way to the true culprit. So that just gives you some of the incredible range of these lives that I tell, as Ilona has mentioned, by really entering their minds and bringing readers, rather like a good novel does, inside how they see the world and how they're able to bring their skills to bear on challenges and obstacles to overcome them, and also how to contribute in new and important ways to neurotypical society. Because, as I should say in closing, the book is as much in the end about neurotypical society as it is about the individuals themselves. It's a testimony to the progress that we as a society have made, that it's even possible to publish this kind of work today and bring these stories to readers, and that these lives exist, that it's possible to be autistic and a surgeon, for example, or to be, as I mentioned, a detective, or to be an academic, or a researcher in psychology, or a novelist, or a comic actor. The last chapter in the book is all about Dan Aykroyd, the comic actor who behind Ghostbusters and Blues Brothers, who has spoken publicly about his Asperger's, as he calls it. And so, as we enter these lives as readers, we understand, I hope, that the world is much richer for these stories, for these experiences, and that they owe so much to the change in mentality in the neurotypical world that has made these careers possible, even though, as the stories make clear, there remain obstacles and a long way still to go, but we are moving in the right direction. And I'm very hopeful that this book, as my others, will continue that progress as a society, and that other writers will follow me in producing this new field of literature, neurodivergent literature. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that wonderful, fascinating journey into your mind and briefly into the mind of some of the people that you've spoken about. There is time for questions now, and we'll start with some questions from the audience here, and then if there are some questions that have come in online, we'll take some of those. So, Olivia, does anyone have a question here? There's a question here. Question. There's a question down here. Oh, okay.
Oh, the mic's there.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Daniel, for that talk. That was absolutely amazing to hear, and I think it taught me about the importance of creative thinking to human understanding and the importance of us as educators to make sure we're giving voice to a range of different perspectives. I just wondered, given the range of your abilities and your love of language and your love of numbers, what attracted you to the study of the humanities?
Yes, thank you. I've always considered numbers a kind of language, because for me they are a language, as I mentioned when I described pi as poetry. And for that reason I never felt growing up that I had to choose between, on the one hand, mathematics and sciences, and on the other, the humanities. And for me they were complementary and very similar, in fact. Different ways of reasoning about the world, but entirely, from my perspective, complementary. And so it seemed natural to me when I was a student, an OU student, to study the humanities as a result of my this mutual relationship I feel between the sciences on the one hand and the arts on the other.
Another question here.
Hi Daniel, thank
Hello.
you so much. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
I also sit straddling science and arts, so I understand that.
Fantastic.
I just wonder, because I think your discussion and experience of language and what you experience a language to be was fascinating and quite profound for me. I wonder what your opinion is on whether or not we are at a point in society where our definition of language is restricting how we perceive and see it, and whether we ought to be reaching for a different definition of language than the one that we typically grow up with, which is simply words and books and simply letters. And
Yes. Of course, in terms of linguistics, there's a definition of language which is very, it seems to me rather clear and precise, which is that language is about communicating meaning in a way that is understandable and which allows us to manipulate units of meaning to find new sentences. In fact, the acquisition of language is all about speaking sentences that have never been spoken before, which is why we often find young children making these rather amusing mistakes that adults never make, because they are partly imitating what they hear, but more importantly, inventing based on an intuitive understanding of language and grammar. And as they get older, this knowledge becomes more and more, of course, sophisticated. So that seems important to me, because otherwise we would dilute the meaning. The risk of dilution, diluting the meaning. We can talk broadly about language, animal language, for example, but I know that linguists, I don't know if there are linguists in the room, but linguists would not want necessarily to define animal communication as language as such, simply because we haven't, as far as I'm aware, I have not studied linguistics at a high level, have not observed this ability to invent new meanings, to communicate, yes, to imitate, yes, but to actually invent new meanings, we haven't seen this. So this would seem to be an essential property of language. So as long as we are able to, but yes, we should certainly look at all kinds of ways of exploring communication in the broadest sense possible. So I mentioned the experience of Billy, his name is Billy, a non-verbal man in America, and to what extent he is using language, it's very hard to tell. But he's certainly able to communicate. He has certainly become a communicator. And this is, by the way, it's not what some call facilitated communication. This is a different, an alternative communication which is validated by scientific experimentations. So it's very different, but it allows him to have a degree of autonomy, even though he remains, of course, profoundly impaired by his own experience of autism, and owes so much to the diligence and the courage of his amazing parents, who obviously I was able to interview for the book, and learn so much about Billy's experience that way. Thank you.
Was there a question over here?
Oh yes, the one up there.
Can we hear your favourite bit of pie? If that's okay.
Well, there are so many. But of course I should mention the Feynman point, which comes after 700, I think it's 762 digits, and it's named after Richard Feynman, the physicist, who also had synesthesia. So he also experienced numbers, and I believe also equations, as colours. And I don't know what colour 9 was for Richard Feynman, but for me it's a very dark blue. And so when it's a number, when you repeat the 9 multiple times, as happens with the Feynman point, it produces an incredibly rich blueness, rather like a kind of twilight, that's very soothing, very bewitching. And the Feynman point is you arrive at this point in all of the decimals, 700, and I think, as I said, 762 digits into pi, and it just goes 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, and the odds of having, 6 9s or 1s or 5s in a row like this so early as well, so early in the decimal representation of pi is very interesting for mathematicians, and it's literally 1 in a million, the odds of this particular sequence appearing, so appearing so soon into the sequence is very interesting. So both for that reason and because of that bewitching blueness in the digits, I remember this particularly well.
I have a question,
Yes,
if I may.
please.
You talked about your the outside-in way of understanding autism,
Yes.
and the inside-out way of understanding autism, and you described them as complementary,
Yes.
which would also be my view. But I have encountered the view that the outside-in approach, particularly that of scientists, is not really helpful. What do you think of that?
So I take a very pragmatic view, which is that any approach which improves the life outcomes of people on the spectrum is positive. In my own experience of participating in neuroscientific research, it was profoundly helpful to me to learn about the impairments that I have, for example, as I mentioned, facial recognition. At least at that point in my 20s, I believe that with time I've become conscious of this impairment, better able to recognize and remember facial expressions. And because the researchers I met and worked with were incredibly empathetic and sensitive and very good communicators, very good at communicating what they needed me to be and to do and so on. So I never felt in any way like a guinea pig. I felt very much like an actor, like a participant, a full participant in the process. It's possible that particularly in the past, in the long ago past, I hope, there were researchers who were perhaps less sensitive to the ways that autistic people understand and navigate the world, and perhaps use language that was less precise, perhaps had expectations that were misguided and that made a very hurtful impression. That's possible. And there have been some one or two experiences that I've had and have written about where the researchers were perhaps less sensitive, but not in a way that finally caused me to in any way question the utility of those approaches. I really do feel that it's complementary. And also, as I write in the book, in 9 Minds, more and more researchers are pioneering an approach in which autistic researchers themselves, because there are autistic men and women. Kana, a Japanese woman who studied in London and in the United States to become a researcher in psychology herself, and was diagnosed as an autistic woman only in her 20s, because in Japan, even to this day, knowledge and understanding of autism is much less prevalent than it is here, has gone on to work with neurotypical researchers hand in hand, so that those two approaches on a day-to-day basis are explored and produce new research which is focused on improving the life outcomes of people on the spectrum, which should be the goal of all research in this area.
Thank you. Louise, do we have some questions from
We
online?
have an awful lot of questions.
Oh my goodness. Well,
I've had a hard time keeping up, but first of all, I want to say on behalf of everyone who's been online, it's been over 300 people. A lot of them have said they felt seen listening to you today, and they've really enjoyed seeing the talk and hearing from you today. So I wanted to put that over first of all. First question is from Jack. Do you find it easier to understand yourself and who you are now since you've been diagnosed? Because it's still something he's still learning to understand.
Yes, I mean, of course, identity is something that is we talk a lot about today, more than ever. It's something it's a concept that is fluid. How we see ourselves in our teens or 20s can be very different to how we see ourselves in a later point in our lives, for example. And so the diagnosis, I was diagnosed at the age of 25, partly, as I mentioned earlier, because autism was so little understood when I was a child, so it would just not have been possible for me to be diagnosed. But I have nephews who are growing up in a very different world now, where it is much better understood, and they have been diagnosed much more quickly on the spectrum, because we understand that it's partly a genetic condition, so it does have a tendency to run in families, which is certainly my family's experience of autism. And so yes, it's positive to have had that diagnosis. Partly because, and this is something that's important to say, the diagnosis gave me a lot of self-knowledge and a way of understanding myself in a new light. It's so strange how that can be the case. It's one word, whether it's a word like autistic or Asperger's, as we said it at the time, or today we might say neurodivergent. But it's a word that opens up windows and in the mind, and brings in a whole new light, and you can look back on a whole life experience and see it in this whole new light. So, for example, growing up, for a long time I felt a kind of, the only word I can use is guilt. I felt guilty that I felt so different from my peers, and that it was in some way my fault, that I was somehow responsible, perhaps lazy, perhaps incompetent. It was very easy to fall into the trap of negative, thinking and being reproachful of myself. And having this diagnosis meant that I understood that it was a biological difference, a natural cognitive difference, which occurs in, we understand today, perhaps 2%, something like 2% of the population. It might be more, it might be less. We are still obviously coming to understand just how prevalent it is, but it's a cognitive, in the same way that as a gay man, I'm very lucky to have grown up in a time where it's possible to understand homosexuality as a natural difference, and not, as it was long considered, some sort of deviancy or deficiency or illness. So as we move away from purely biological models, biological ways of understanding human identity, and look more and more to, although biology plays a role, of course, more and more to social models that help us understand these and other conditions, it allows us to bring in so much more nuance and so much more context, and to see the complexity of these conditions.
You've not got a train to catch you, I think, because there's a lot of questions.
Yes, please.
Another one here. Do you feel the same way about other numbers, such as E? And do you feel differently about pi when thinking in another language, especially Manti? And that's from James.
Yes. So I have this experience with pi, exclusively with pi, in comparison to other irrational, what we call irrational numbers, only because it's the number that I learned at school, and so it was the number I fell in love with, in a sense, in the same way that my husband today, my French husband Jerome, if I'd met someone else, it would have been, a completely different story. But I met him, I fell in love with him. I've been with Jerome for 17 years now. This is the life I have with him. In the same way, pi, I fell in love with pi, and it's pi, and it's not E or any other irrational number, and that's just the way it is. And when I'm reciting pi, so I recited it in English, of course, because I was in Oxford in England, as I mentioned, so I had to recite the numbers in English, even though in my mind it was not in English, it was in this numerical, visual language that I've described during this talk. If I recite the number in another language, in French or Manti, the language I invented as a child, which has some resemblance to Finnish, the first foreign language I learned at all to speak, I experience the numbers in the same way, only because my mind is exploring the relationships between the numbers and not the words that we use in each language to describe them.
Let's have a look at another one. A lady asked, she wondered why at school did it not occur to you to copy other children's language rather than trying to get it from books?
Partly because the children were not very easy to imitate. They were, they didn't long enough. They were always running and moving and kicking footballs, and I was very sensitive to noise, as I mentioned, very sensitive to sudden movements, and also had a difficulty with personal space, which is typical, I believe, of many children on the spectrum. At a young age, I didn't understand the concept of personal space for a time, and would, in order to feel close to someone, literally stand too close to them, for example, and had to acquire over time a true understanding of personal space. So for all these reasons, I was just too awkward, too lacking in social graces to really fold in enough with the crowd and acquire this knowledge this way. So I would go to books for it, and of course later it was easier for me to observe other children, and I observed my siblings growing up a lot, and I owe a lot of my social skills, I imagined, to them.
I'm going to ask this one because I feel, as we're with the OU, and obviously research is obviously a big part of it, Zoe asks, what elements of the autistic experience do you believe are most in need of further research at this time?
Well, being that I'm a writer, I'm going to preach for my parish, for my church, and say that we really should be beginning to look at academic in an academic light and a critical light, autistic literature itself. So obviously there is autobiography, and that goes back to, for example, Temple Grandin's. That's 40 years, that people, and Les Murray's poetry, which, as far as we understand, is the first published creative work by an autistic writer, goes back even earlier to the 1960s. And yet, even now in 2024, there's very little research, very little analysis of what autistic writers are doing creatively, how they produce their work, how their use of metaphor, for example, is perhaps different to neurotypical writers, how they treat different themes, approach different themes and tackle them in different ways. I suspect many of the differences are rather subtle, because neurodivergent writers have very often neurotypical models, role models. So a part of all good writing is imitation. You begin by imitating your peers, and then you find your voice as you do so. So I would not be at all surprised to find that differences are, in some areas, quite small, but they certainly, I'm sure, exist. And I would just be very curious, even from the perspective of my own work, as I mentioned, which is already 20 years old, to have academics bring their tools to bear on what I'm doing. A lot of writing is actually unconscious. It's intuitive. It's creative in a way that writers themselves do not fully understand. So it would be fascinating to see what these academics would come up with in that field.
Any more? We've got some more minutes.
Yeah, we have some more.
We have some more
Yeah.
time.
See if we
You're
can
all
choose a
right
good
with
Yes,
one
I'm very
then.
happy to answer more questions.
I've got one from Dave. Do you think there is support and understanding offered to neurotypical children to accept and understand those with neurodivergence?
That's a very good point. And I believe that there's a long way to go in that respect. Children learn from an early age to identify behaviours that would be considered today racist, for example, or homophobic, or irrational fears of immigrants, for example, and so on. There is much less understanding of how neurodivergent children are treated by their neurotypical peers. I'd like to believe that in the long time since I was at school, things have improved. Apparently, in some places that is the case. My nephews, for example, tell me that it is easier for them than it was for their uncle, for myself, to navigate school today. But it's not necessarily because the other children have been taught that, but just because children pick up from the popular culture the fact that neurodivergency is a thing, it exists, it's a natural difference, that it is not in itself any sort of issue. There are TV shows now that feature neurodivergent characters. There are popular novels that feature neurodivergent characters. We could debate the realism of those portrayals and question perhaps some of the ways that they continue perhaps to consciously or unconsciously produce cliches around what autistic experience is really like. But it's still a sign of progress, and it is very helpful, I suspect, to neurotypical children in the absence of a more formal approach by schools. So yes, that would be something that schools could embrace in the future, absolutely.
They would like to know, Junior Scully wants to know, what is your view on the term spectrum? Is it too linear or
limiting, which is both what makes it so helpful and also something that we have to be careful about as well. My own personal view is that spectrum is a very good word, because it really helps us to at the very least describe just how diverse neurodiversity can be, as the book portrays. And these 9 men and women are incredibly diverse, so you go from a non-verbal man's experience all the way to a prize-winning novelist's experience, so a highly verbal autistic woman's experience. And you have a surgeons and murder detectives, the research in psychology is so very, very varied. And spectrum at least allows us the moment we hear the word, to at least understand instinctively this idea of that variation. And also I kind of like the relationship to the idea of rainbow, a spectrum of light. The idea that, rather like with homosexuality, it's about variation and diversity within something that's entirely natural. The way that light produces all kinds of colours, but in a way that is unified and natural and complementary. It's quite a beautiful metaphor, I think, for thinking about sexual and also cognitive differences.
Fantastic. I just want to say, if you ever get a chance to look at the chat on YouTube, please do, because there's an awful lot of people saying thank you.
Oh, thank you.
They're saying that they feel seen, they feel heard, and what you've gone through, they're going through now, and they've been supporting each other immensely.
Oh.
So that's fantastic. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Any more? Is that it? Yeah. For now. Right. Well, after that wonderful talk, I'd like to conclude by just actually touching on something else which, according to a traditional view, would be absent in people with autism, autistic people, and that is imagination. And I think that your talk has shown that, by contrast, you have an enormously rich and unique imagination. And that is a lesson to us all. So thank you for that wonderful talk and wonderful introduction to your new book. I hope it does very well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.